Tensions are increasing in Denmark as hordes of refugees continue pouring into the country.
It has some of the most restrictive immigration policies in the EU.
We're not interested in getting a whole lot of people who we're supposed to integrate.
Migrants are arriving uninvited and refusing to adopt Danish customs.
The Danish government says it no longer has space for Muslim immigrants. Recently, the open and welcoming arms of Denmark have become so cold and hostile towards immigrants, especially Muslims.
And we have a rising Islamic problem in Denmark. We have a number of Islamic parties, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Salafists, and so on.
In just a few years, the country has made rules that now make every part of Denmark completely unbearable for Muslim immigrants. In fact, many of them have begun to flee the country, and intending immigrants are no longer given the chance to move into the country. As expected, these extreme rules have stirred debates all over the world.
Mr. Donald Trump, who has opted for not taking in Muslims at all in the U.S.
Do you support that? Do you support that position? You think all Muslims should be barred from Denmark?
Some think the Danish government has a point, while many others think of the new rules as completely inhumane and a little over the top. However, you may also get to pick a side as we give you the tea about the whole immigration saga. Let's dig deep into the untold secrets and see why Denmark suddenly declares war on Muslim immigration. The best place. For many years, Denmark remained like the typical greener pasture sought by almost everyone. It is unarguably one of the best places to live in the whole world, and statistics clearly show it. When it comes to the key indicators of the quality of life, such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure, Denmark ranks really high. In fact, it has stayed undefeated on top of the chart for years and years now. The most enticing thing about Denmark is that it is one of the richest countries in the world. For context, an average worker in Denmark has a monthly take-home of about $53,000. However, the Danish government knows better than to cater to their working-class population only. This explains why Denmark's welfare system is second to none. The aged population are placed on pension by the government, and even the young ones are entitled to a lot of incentives. This generational wealth and maximum welfare has greatly reduced Denmark's crime rate to as little as 0, and this means that it is one of the most secure countries in the world. I mean, everyone has all they need, and no one has to bother about anything. Why then should anyone commit a crime? There's absolutely no reason. However, not every nation in the world is like Denmark. In fact, most are nothing close to it. So, in contrast, most of the smaller nations around have been faced with extreme issues in the past decades. Talk of high levels of insecurities in places like Syria and Pakistan. These unbearable issues have caused the residents who are majorly Muslims to flee their countries in search of safety and a better life. And, as expected, Denmark often sits on the list of the most attractive places for these immigrants and more people across the globe. Well, good for them. Denmark has been a pro-immigration country, taking in as many immigrants as possible. In fact, it is one of the first European countries that opened its doors to asylum seekers from these unsettled countries. Between 2005 and 2015, Denmark took in over 100,000 refugees from Asia and the Middle East. For this reason, Denmark's population has risen over the last 3 decades, and the Danish government still received more and more migrants until recently. It's sad to say, and it's very far from where it started, but things have gone sour for immigrants in Denmark. Everyone can't help but wonder what's really up with Denmark. But after an in-depth look at the situation, critics have realized that the new development can be blamed on a number of things. First off, in the last few years, the Danish opinion on the subject of immigration has changed completely. In fact, it's not only a government thing. All Danes across the country have been taking a stronger stand against migration than they used to. Tensions have begun to rise in Denmark as thousands and thousands of refugees keep finding their way into the country. So, right now, Denmark has some of the most restrictive immigration policies in Europe. Things seem to be getting tougher, and we can't help but ask why. The fear of a fall. Somehow, this sudden change in Denmark's approach to migration can be linked to a major fear in the hearts of the people. This has to do with the one thing that is most dear to the Danish government. We're talking about the welfare of the people and the country here. In case you're wondering, this fear did not just grow on the people, it must have come from a pattern which they have studied around them. Being a country ruled by brains, we shouldn't be shocked that Denmark would take notes from what they have seen happen to countries around them, especially as a result of immigration. And, to make that make sense, the example is not far-fetched. Let's take a look at Sweden, for example, a country which is only about 10 minutes away from Denmark. Just like the Danish government, the Swedish community has been quite open to immigrants, maybe more open than Denmark was. But, in recent times, it looks like the beauty and wealth of Sweden has been overshadowed by the ugly sides of excessive migration. Gang issues and reports of violent crime have become a major headache in Sweden. And when compared to the last decade, Sweden's crime statistics are not looking good. The same Sweden that had one of the lowest gun crime rates in Europe in the last 10 years now ranks second highest in the entire continent. If that is not shocking enough, the rate of gun violence in Stockholm alone is about 30 times greater than that of London. How scary does that sound? Yeah, Sweden has been going through the most turbulent wave of violent crime issues, and when you dig deep into the crime stories, it's very certain that you will find immigrants somewhere there. Most likely young, unemployed, non-Western immigrants. So, with these things happening to Sweden, which is just a stone throw away from Denmark, it only makes sense that the Danes begin to fear the unknown. This fear has fueled some of the most extreme immigration rules Europe has ever seen. Now, that brings us to the shocking discoveries which have been made around Denmark since these rules became a thing, and how it really affects the Muslim immigrants. The fairly old war. As we've established earlier, most of the countries which are exposed to insecurities are Islamic nations in Asia and the Middle East. So, people from these countries such as Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, and Lebanon see Denmark as the best option for them. However, since more of these immigrants are Muslims, the Danish government categorizes a larger part of their immigrant population as Muslims. And you know what that means? Whatever consequences that came from immigration are linked to the Muslim immigrants. For a fact, the Muslim population of Denmark is about 4%, but, no doubt, they have had an ugly past in the country. Maybe even worse than what the same extreme immigration is doing to Sweden right now. From the start, the Danish laws do not seem to favor Muslim immigrants, and it looks like the Muslim community is being set up sometimes. I mean, Denmark is probably the only nation in Europe where racist and anti-Islamic comments are not frowned at. Inciting public uproar or hate is not considered a crime either. As simple as that sounded, it has caused one of the most unforgettable riots in Denmark in the past. We're talking about January 2006, when the population of Muslims became furious and started setting the Danish flags ablaze. They clashed with the police, vandalized 10 million euros worth of property, and also ransacked the embassy. This urban riot was considered the greatest in the history of Europe, and guess what? All that went down because a particular newspaper published 12 cartoons of the Holy Prophet, and the Muslim population regarded this as sacrilege. However, instead of making more favorable laws for the Islamic immigrants, the Danish government chose to make things tighter. In fact, before the government made any move, the Muslims were no longer welcome in the eyes of the Danes. So, every form of hostility that came after can be traced to this ugly situation. Recently, this hostility towards the Muslim immigrants have been expressed in different ways, and that brings us to the real deal: the extreme laws which have made Denmark unwelcoming for immigrants. Deportation and detention camps. Less than 10 years after the major riot happened, the Danish government started sending Muslim immigrants back to their countries. As you probably already know, these immigrants fled from their countries due to the lack of peace and a high level of insecurity. However, due to what went down between the Danish government and the Muslim immigrants, the government set up a deportation rule for most of the immigrants from these nations. According to them, the countries were now safe and the refugees could return to where they came from. In fact, this law affected some who were just aspiring to move into the country. Denmark denied them entrance, saying that their countries were now settled and they could survive there. Coupled with this mass deportation, the Danish government built about 10 detention centers all over Denmark, and they had no other roles than to house refugees, or literally keep them until it was time for deportation. In these detention centers, there were refugees who were told to return to their countries but could not return yet, since the condition of their home countries were not good enough. But one thing about these detention centers is that the conditions were just a little better than being in a prison. The refugees were only allowed to stroll out for only about an hour or two in a day. They are not allowed to have any money. They are served meals and rations, and they keep counting days until the time is right for them to return to their countries. Right now, there are over 40,000 people in these detention centers across Denmark, and one unarguable fact is that they are mostly Muslim immigrants from the unsettled Islamic nations. Seizing of items. It's a known fact that immigrants are being sent out of Denmark, and it's been quite a chore before new immigrants are allowed into the nation. But even for those that are allowed, there are laws in place that make their stay as hard as possible. On top of that list is the rule which allows, or makes it mandatory, for officers to seize all the valuable items found on new immigrants. Yeah, everyone thinks of that as a really inhumane rule to make, but the Danish government has its reasons for that, and it's quite understandable. We've spoken of Denmark as a nation with one of the best welfare systems, and there is such a balance between whatever comes out of people's pockets and what goes back into it. Let's just say that Danes get to receive the best values for their money. However, with the surge in immigration and the low rate of input of these immigrants to the nation's economy, this balance is being disturbed. I mean, the number of people drawing from the nation's welfare suddenly increases without a corresponding rise in contributions. So, this has put a form of pressure on the nation's economy, and this ends up affecting the welfare of the people. Okay, guys, I guess we should break that down further. Immigration to Denmark has been higher than usual over the past decade, and this has contributed to a detectable rise in the country's population. Just 10 years ago, speaking of 2014, more than 8% of Denmark's population were immigrants, and as we've said earlier, a large part of them were from the troubled Islamic nations. However, the problem is not that they are from non-Western countries, rather it is that these non-Western migrants tend to earn way lower than Danes. For example, the annual income before tax for an average male immigrant from Syria, Somalia, and Bulgaria was about 3,000 euros. However, for Danes, it was about 6,000 euros. So, this huge gap easily translates into wealth for an average Dane, and by the time they are 60, they would have saved 8 times as much as a non-Western immigrant would. If that sounds like mere speculation, the Danish government actually has these facts written in papers. These papers give details of the average financial contribution of those living in Denmark. This was calculated by subtracting their total costs from their total contributions to the country's finances. At the end of the whole math, they discovered that native Danish people contributed a net total of 41 billion Danish kroner. Don't get it twisted, guys. The immigrants contributed as well, but sadly, they had a negative contribution. Yep, instead of adding to the system, they actually owe a debt of about 24 billion kroner. This is because the children and the elderly usually use more government funds than they can contribute. And to strike a balance, the people of working age have to contribute significantly to the country's welfare. However, this is not the case for the non-Western immigrants, as they are mostly refugees and asylum seekers who may not be able to contribute so much to the economy. In a way, this should only make sense for the first generation of immigrants, since it must have taken a lot of time before they could learn the country's language and develop the skills necessary to earn a higher wage in the economy. However, seeing how it has persisted over decades and generations, the Danish government was sure that a large percentage of immigrants were just leeching off Denmark, and the consequences may be uglier in the future. In fact, it already started to show because this poor integration of immigrants has caused a higher level of child poverty among non-Western immigrants in Denmark. It was discovered that 36% of children aged between 10 and 14 were living in poverty, and it gets mind-boggling when the number is only 2% for Danish children of the same age. So, to avoid the repercussions of a rising poor population in a relatively wealthy nation, the Danish government decided to confiscate all valuable items found on refugees. This way, the items can be liquefied. The money goes into the welfare of migrants, and a balance is created. Would you say that actually made sense? Well, maybe. The removal of ghetto. It is a widespread belief that poverty increases the rate of crime, most especially violent crimes. To further prove that, researchers have found out that 10% of people living in the poorest countries had about 6 times higher crime rate than the 10% living in the least poor countries. So, this research justifies Denmark's fear as far as the rising population of immigrants is concerned. As the poverty rate increases with the number of immigrants, Denmark could longer be sure of a crime-free state in the near future. And to them, there was only one way to reduce the rate of poverty. Not by providing jobs for immigrants, but by reducing their number. Therefore, to further curb the increasing population and reduce the rate of poverty, the government came up with a new law, the one which has been said to be the most controversial. So far, most people have raised an eyebrow at the Danish government's resolve to completely eradicate ghettos in the country. The new strategy, which Denmark called the Ghetto Plan, is seen as their most controversial move so far. It is a policy which aims at removing all the ghettos in the country and having a slum-free Denmark by 2030. While this does not sound like a direct fight against the immigrants, it is presented as a plan to reduce crime, unemployment, and increase integration. But who lives in these ghettos anyway? Immigrants. These slums are precisely neighborhoods with the most number of immigrants, especially Muslim immigrants from non-Western countries. So, I guess we should know that any plan that directly affects the ghettos is aimed at the immigrants themselves. And the Danish government proved that right when it listed the features that made up this ghetto plan. One of them is the mandatory child care and education requirement for all children over the age of 1. So, all ghetto kids who are mostly from non-Western backgrounds are to spend at least 25 hours a week in school, where they would be taught the Danish language and national values. In fact, they made it so strict that if anyone failed to comply, their social welfare would be reduced or totally removed. But that was just a tip of the iceberg. The main idea of the Ghetto Plan was to demolish and privatize all public houses which were used by immigrants in these ghetto areas. These ghettos, which house over half of the population of non-Western immigrants, have been marked out for redevelopment. So, all the old ghetto houses are being demolished, and the fairly good ones are sold to private investors. Now, the government has its reasons. The real plan is to attract rich Western residents to these ghetto areas. By 2030, when the Ghetto Plan is done, the poor population of immigrants would have been removed and replaced with Western residents. It is believed that this will reduce the rate of crime and improve integration. No doubt, not everyone sees the light in this new policy, and it has faced a high level of criticism. Danes in some parts of the country, especially Copenhagen, have protested against the new law, and they strongly believe that these laws are totally racist. They've walked the streets with placards and also used their voices in the media. But have these really done much to stop the policy? It doesn't look like it. Provocations and incitement. While a few Danes in some parts of Denmark are doing a lot to get the government to do better and rethink the new policies, a larger percentage of Danes cannot seem to hide their hatred and probably disgust for Muslim immigrants. In the past few months, there have been a high level of provocations, and it's even shocking that the government is not doing so much to stop it. An example of that is the public hatred that Muslims faced when they recently gathered to feast after Ramadan. As they sat in the open, gisting, laughing, and taking photos, some angry Danes barged in on them and made many racist slurs. Some even went as far as saying that Europe wasn't for Muslims and they should return to their countries. However, the highest level of provocation Muslims in Denmark have faced was in the hands of one man, Rasmus Paludan. This guy enters a neighborhood of Muslim immigrants, heavily guarded by the police, only to do all sorts of terrible things with their holy book. All he wanted was to get just one person to fight back, thinking maybe he could recreate the 2006 saga, implicate the Muslims, and have them leave once and for all. However, unfortunately for him, he hasn't succeeded in his plans so far. Also, as much as Denmark keeps getting hostile day by day, the immigrants seem to develop thick skin, and they seem to adapt. So, seeing that they've not really been able to push out as many Muslim immigrants as they want, even after the extreme laws, Denmark has started taking harder measures. This time, they want to make sure that fewer migrants enter the country each year. And they're not thinking only about Denmark this time, it concerns other neighboring countries as well. So, Denmark is now leading a group of 15 European Union member states, and they are calling for the EU to put more measures in place to prevent migrants from arriving at the EU borders in the first place. They have suggested incentivizing non-EU countries along migration routes to accept large numbers of refugees before they even get to Europe. Recently, it was discovered that Denmark was even making plans to outsource asylum procedures to Rwanda. The Danish government is also partnering with third countries outside Europe, like Albania and Turkey, to handle these migrants. Lately, the Danish government seems to be making some other plans, which are now known to only a few. The plan is to send hundreds of immigrants to a secluded island in Kalvehave. According to the news, the Danish government has been working on a place on the island of Lindholm as a new home for immigrants. The location, which was first used as an animal testing center, is now being polished and renovated into a new home for immigrants. But whether the idea is a good one or not is even far from the problem here. The problem is that the inhabitants of the village surrounding the island are not buying this new idea at all. They are convinced that the introduction of a new population of immigrants to that area will put more pressure on their resources. And, most importantly, there seems to be a fear of crime becoming rampant in the area if the immigrants are moved to the island. Clearly, Denmark is taking a number of measures just to make sure that Muslim immigrants are far away from them. And, as it is, these measures are not only getting stricter, they are becoming the toughest among all other European countries. But, when we put the government out of the equation, the larger percentage of Danes are not even making this any better. I guess it's just time up for Muslim immigrants in every corner of Denmark. This is where we would bring this interesting video to a close, guys. Now, it's your turn to tell us what you think about this awkward situation. Do you think that Denmark is right for putting these strict measures in place? Or is the government just doing too much? Do you think the Muslim immigrants have also contributed to this messy situation in any way? Let's have your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you have any questions at all about this insightful topic, you can ask in the comments section as well.